The text came in after business hours. It was short, clean, professional. Wire instructions. Account name included the word escrow. The sender said closing could not move forward without it. The buyer hesitated. Then they sent the money. No receipt followed. No callback, just silence. By morning, the number went straight to voicemail. At the bank, a clerk said the wire had settled. Funds released. Nothing pending. Nothing reversible. A second call reached a real law office. The receptionist checked. There was no file, no client, no trust account tied to that transaction. The word escrow had done its job. It slowed the pulse. It quieted doubt. It bought time. By the time the fraud unit answered, hours were gone. The account was real. The phone was prepaid. The language had been copied from public templates. Somewhere, the money was already moving. This was not a smash and grab. It was calm. It was polite. It was designed to feel safe until the moment safety vanished. Chapter 1. Setup and Stakes. The message arrived at 6:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. The workday was over. Offices were closed. That detail mattered later. The buyer was at home, shoes off, phone in hand. The text came from a number they did not recognize. The tone felt familiar anyway. Professional, controlled, short sentences. No slang, no rush, but no softness either. Wire instructions were attached as a photo. Clean layout. Bank name spelled correctly. Account title included the word escrow. There was a deadline. Funds needed to be placed before close. Tomorrow morning was too late. The buyer read it twice. Then again, they had been waiting for this. The deal had moved quickly, faster than expected. A small commercial property, not flashy, not risky on paper. The seller wanted speed. The broker had said that up front. Speed meant leverage. The buyer checked the name on the account. It sounded right. Neutral, corporate, the kind of name that did not draw attention, the kind that blended in. They replied with one question, just to confirm. The response came back in less than a minute. Yes, that is correct. Please proceed tonight to avoid delay. There was no greeting, no signature, just instruction. The buyer stood up and paced the kitchen. They had wired funds before. This was not new. The amount was large, but not life-ending. Still, it was enough to hurt. Enough to matter. They called their bank's after-hours line. A recorded voice explained the limits. Wires could be initiated online. Confirmation would come after processing. Reversals were not guaranteed once settled. The buyer opened the banking app, entered the numbers carefully, checked each field. Routing number matched a major institution. Account number had the right length. Everything lined up. They paused at the final screen. The word escrow sat there again, calm, official, protective. They pressed submit. The app displayed a confirmation screen. Reference number issued. Status pending. The buyer took a screenshot. Just in case. They sent a text back. Wire sent. Please confirm receipt. No response. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The buyer checked the app again. Status updated, completed. The money was gone. They waited until 8 p.m., then sent another message. Just checking in. Nothing. At 9 p.m. they called the number. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. A generic greeting. No name. The buyer slept poorly. Woke up before dawn. Checked the phone. No messages. At 7:30 a.m., they called the number again. Straight to voicemail. Panic did not hit all at once. It came in waves. Small at first, controlled. They opened the app. The transaction still showed completed, no alerts, no warnings. At 8:15 a.m., they called their bank branch. The call was routed, then transferred, then placed on hold. A representative finally picked up. The buyer explained the situation, slowly, carefully. They did not use the word scam. Not yet. The representative checked the wire, confirmed settlement. Funds released to the receiving bank late the previous night. The buyer asked if it could be reversed. The answer was careful. Recovery was unlikely once funds settled. A request could be submitted. No guarantees. The buyer asked when the funds had arrived. The representative gave a time, 11:53 p.m. The buyer thanked them and hung up. They called the broker next. No answer. Left a message. Then they called the law firm listed on the paperwork. The name matched the account title loosely, close enough to feel right the night before. A receptionist answered. Bright voice. Busy office sounds in the background. The buyer asked for the escrow department. The receptionist paused, asked for more detail. The buyer explained. Slowly again. The property, the wire, the account name. The receptionist put them on hold. When she returned, her voice had changed, softer, cautious. There was no file under that buyer's name. No transaction. No trust account associated with that deal. The buyer asked if the firm ever used text message wire instructions. The receptionist said no. Never! The buyer asked if the account name sounded familiar. The receptionist said it did not. The buyer hung up and sat down. This was the moment the ground shifted. They called the bank again. Asked for the fraud unit. This time the language changed. Scam. Unauthorized misrepresentation. Possible impersonation. The fraud unit opened a case. Gave a reference number. Explained the steps. A recall request would be sent. The receiving bank would be contacted. Timing mattered. The buyer asked how much time they had. The answer was not exact. Hours, maybe less. The buyer forwarded the wire receipt. Sent screenshots of the texts. Provided the phone number. The fraud agent asked if the buyer had spoken to the sender by voice. They had not. The fraud agent asked if the sender had ever used email. They had not. The fraud agent asked when the number first contacted them. The buyer checked the message log, 6:14 p.m. yesterday. After hours, the fraud agent made a note. At 10:30 a.m., the broker finally called back. Sounded confused, then alarmed. They had not sent any wire instructions. They had not asked for funds yet. Closing was scheduled for next week. The buyer felt the panic sharpen. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a clerical delay. The broker asked for the number. The buyer sent it. The broker said they had heard of this before. Rare, but not unheard of. Someone had intercepted communication, or guessed timing, or watched public records. The buyer asked how. The broker did not know. By noon, the bank called back. The receiving institution had acknowledged the recall request. No freeze yet. Funds may have moved. The buyer asked how much. The agent did not know. The buyer asked if the account was real. The agent said yes. Newly opened, private account, not an actual escrow regulated by any authority. The buyer asked how that was allowed. The agent said account names were largely unregulated. Words like trust and escrow carried no automatic protections. The buyer wrote that down. At 1:15 p.m., the fraud unit called again. A partial outbound transfer had been detected. A portion of the funds had moved to another account earlier that morning. The buyer asked how much. The agent gave a number, less than half, more than zero. The buyer felt sick. The agent said they were escalating. A freeze request was being prioritized. Legal review was underway. The buyer asked if the rest could be saved. The agent did not promise. The phone number stopped responding completely after that. No rings, no voicemail. Disconnected. The burner phone was gone. The buyer sat at their desk, staring at the wire receipt. Everything on it looked legitimate. Every field was correct. Every number matched something real. The only lie had been the person on the other end. By late afternoon, the bank confirmed the freeze. Remaining funds were locked. A portion was safe. A portion was already lost. No arrest had been made. No suspect identified. The buyer understood something then. This had not been rushed. It had been timed. After hours. Between steps. Inside the quiet space where urgency could masquerade as professionalism. The word escrow had not protected them. It had disarmed them. And the clock was not done yet. Chapter 2. Escalation and reversal. The freeze did not mean relief. It meant a pause. A thin one. The buyer learned that before the day ended. At 4:40 p.m., the fraud unit called back. The remaining balance was secured, but the outbound transfer had already cleared. The money was not sitting in a single place anymore. It had split, moved through at least 2 intermediary accounts. The buyer asked if that mattered. The agent said yes. Every step away from the original account reduced the chance of recovery. The buyer asked how this could happen so fast. The agent explained that the account had been opened less than 2 weeks earlier. It was flagged as low history. That should have raised friction. It did not. The transfer amounts stayed under internal alert thresholds. The movements looked deliberate, not panicked. This was not a grab, it was paced. The buyer asked who owned the account. The agent said that information required legal process, subpoena, court order, time. Time was already gone. The next morning, the buyer sat in a conference room at their bank branch. The room was small, glass walls, neutral art. A compliance officer joined by phone. A fraud supervisor sat across the table. They went through the timeline again, minute by minute, message arrival, wire initiation, settlement time, outbound transfer. The supervisor pointed to the gap, the hours between settlement and freeze. That was where the damage happened. The buyer asked why the receiving bank had not flagged the outbound movement. The compliance officer explained that the account holder had full authority. The account name did not trigger special oversight. Trust and escrow were just words. The buyer asked why those words were allowed at all. The answer was procedural. Naming conventions were not tightly regulated. Banks verified identity, not semantics. If the paperwork cleared, the name stood. The buyer stared at the table. Later that day, the buyer spoke with a private attorney. Not to sue, to understand. The attorney explained the difference between a regulated trust account and a private account with trust in the title. Real escrow accounts were tied to licensed entities, audited, segregated. This account was none of that. It was a container. The buyer asked how someone could impersonate a firm so cleanly. The attorney said it was easier than people thought. Public filings, marketing material, templates, all available. A convincing message did not require access. It required timing. Timing came from watching. The buyer thought back. The broker had mentioned the deal in passing on a voicemail weeks earlier. Property address, price range, enough to anchor a story. The attorney said these schemes often waited. They did not rush. They entered late when pressure was highest and verification paths were shortest. That night, the buyer slept again, but lightly. The phone stayed on the nightstand, silent. The next day, a new call came in, a different fraud analyst. This one was calm, almost detached. He explained that the outbound funds had moved through a regional bank, then into a larger institution. From there, they were broken into smaller transfers, some international, some domestic. The buyer asked if that meant laundering. The analyst said he could not characterize it yet. Allegation versus proof mattered. The buyer asked if law enforcement was involved. The analyst said a report had been filed. That did not mean action. Volume mattered. Priority mattered. The buyer asked if this would be investigated. The analyst paused, then said, possibly. That was not comforting. A second victim appeared the same afternoon. Not through the bank, through a forwarded email. Someone the buyer had never met. Same account name, same phone number. Different property, different city. Their wire had been smaller. Their loss total. They connected through their attorneys. Compared notes. The language was identical. Even the punctuation matched. This was not a one-off. The buyer sent the new information to the fraud unit. The analyst acknowledged it, said it strengthened the case. The buyer asked if it changed recovery odds. The analyst said no. On day 4, the burner phone reappeared briefly. A single text, delayed apology, claimed a banking error, promised resolution. The buyer did not respond. The fraud unit captured the message, traced it, same prepaid network, same device class, no location. Then it went dark again. The buyer felt anger then, not panic, not fear. Anger at the calmness of it. This person was not hiding, they were pacing. At the end of the week, the bank confirmed that no additional funds had moved. The freeze held. Half the money was still there. The buyer asked how long it would stay frozen. The answer depended on court action. Without a court order, the bank could not hold indefinitely. The account holder would eventually challenge. The buyer asked how soon that could happen. The answer was days, not weeks. The attorney filed an emergency motion. Requested judicial authorization to maintain the freeze. The buyer read the draft. It was clinical. No emotion. Just facts. Wire sent. Account misrepresented. Funds transferred. Partial loss. The judge granted the order 2 days later. Temporary. Narrow. The freeze extended. It felt like a win. It was not. The buyer learned that same day that the outbound funds had landed in accounts beyond domestic jurisdiction. Recovery would require international cooperation. That process was slow, often unsuccessful. The buyer asked if this meant the money was gone. The analyst said it meant the probability was low. The buyer asked why the system allowed this. The analyst said systems evolved to move money fast. Fraud adapted faster. Another call came in that evening. Not from the bank, from the broker. The seller was asking questions. They had heard rumors, something about a wire issue. The deal was on hold. The buyer explained carefully. Without details, without blame. The broker said this could kill the deal. The buyer said the deal was already dead. Silence followed. The buyer sat alone after the call. The house felt quiet in a way it had not before. The space between sounds stretched. This was the reversal. Not the money, the realization. The trap had not been the account, or the phone, or the timing. It had been the assumption that professionalism meant legitimacy. The buyer reviewed the texts again, the clean language, the lack of urgency, the confidence. That was the hook. The fraud had not forced anything. It had invited compliance. At the end of the second week, The bank confirmed final numbers. 51% recovered, 49% gone. No suspect name, no arrest, just paperwork. The buyer signed documents, acknowledged loss, accepted partial restitution. The attorney explained next steps, civil options, low probability, high cost. The buyer declined. This was not about revenge. It was about understanding. As the chapter closed, the buyer realized the freeze was not the turning point. The turning point was knowing the system had worked exactly as designed. Fast, polite, and only half awake. Chapter 3, Resolution and Aftermath. The court order arrived without ceremony, a stamped document, a few pages. It carried authority, but no comfort. The bank compliance team read it carefully. The freeze would hold. The remaining funds would not move without further instruction. That was the good news. The rest had already vanished. Investigators laid out what they could prove. The outbound transfers had followed a familiar pattern. Small splits, short pauses, new accounts. Each step added distance. Each step reduced clarity. No single transfer looked dramatic. Together they erased a trail. The buyer asked if the destination accounts had been identified. The answer was partial. Names existed, documents existed, proof of control did not. Each account holder appeared unrelated on paper. Different banks, different regions, some domestic, some outside the country. Layering, the investigator called it. The buyer asked if this meant organized crime. The investigator was careful. Allegation was not proof. What could be said was limited. The structure suggested planning. The timing suggested experience. Nothing more. The burner phone was never recovered. The number remained disconnected. The prepaid account had been purchased with cash at a retail outlet that no longer had footage. The device had done its job. The second victim joined a conference call the following week. They sounded tired. Their loss had been smaller. Their recovery was zero. They had not caught the freeze in time. They asked the buyer how they had moved so fast. The buyer said they trusted their instincts. That was not entirely true. They had trusted the system. The bank issued a final letter. It outlined what had been recovered, what had been lost, what actions had been taken, what actions could not be taken. There was language about regret. There was language about responsibility. There was no apology. The buyer signed the acknowledgement. The signature felt heavier than expected. A financial expert was brought in afterward. Not by the bank, by the buyer. He explained how the word escrow functioned psychologically. It implied separation, safety, oversight. It lowered defenses. It slowed verification. It suggested a neutral middle where risk paused. In reality, none of that existed unless enforced by law. The expert said the scheme did not rely on technical failure. It relied on human rhythm. End of day. Closing pressure, professional tone, no raised voice. It created a space where asking one more question felt unnecessary. The buyer asked if this could happen again. The expert said yes. The buyer asked how often it did. The expert said more than reported. Settlements followed quietly. Banks reimbursed when liability was clear. When it was not, losses stayed with the sender. Many victims chose silence. Reputation mattered. The buyer understood that now. Law enforcement sent a brief update weeks later. The case remained open. No suspects identified. No charges filed. The buyer filed it away. The property deal dissolved without drama. The seller moved on. The broker apologized. No one admitted fault. Life resumed but altered. The buyer changed habits. No wires without voice confirmation. No instructions after hours. No reliance on names alone. They shared the story with a few people, trusted ones. The reactions were similar. Shock. Then recognition. Stories surfaced, near misses, friends of friends. The trap was not rare. It was just quiet. Months later, a policy update circulated through the buyer's bank. New warnings, new disclosures, stronger language around wire fraud. Education framed as prevention. The buyer read it carefully. It would help some, not all. The final accounting came at the end of the quarter. The loss was absorbed. Not comfortably, but survivable. That was another part of the trap. It often targeted people who could endure the hit. Fewer questions, fewer headlines. The buyer reflected on that often. This scheme had not needed force. It had not needed speed. It had not needed deception in the dramatic sense. It had needed belief. Belief that the presence of a system meant protection. Belief that professional language equaled legitimacy. Belief that someone else was watching. In the end, no one was. The buyer kept one thing from the experience. The screenshot of the confirmation page. A reminder. Not of loss, but of how easily certainty could be manufactured. The trust account had been real. The trust itself had not. That was the cost. Not just the money that never came back, but the understanding that safety, when outsourced, often disappears first. The case closed without resolution. The outcome landed unevenly. Partial recovery, no accountability, quiet continuation. And somewhere else, another message would arrive after business hours. Clean, polite, calm, waiting.